keto and carnivore are just trendy new diets.
Well, you see, trendy, that's been used as a way of being derogatory, but something that's trendy means a lot of people like it. So that's the first thing. But of course, they're not trendy diets. They have been around a long time. If you're looking at the formal labeling of, say, the ketogenic diet, that was 1921. Dr. Peterman at the Mayo Clinic first used that term. Well, that's over 100 years ago. Now, I don't think you can call that a fad or a trendy diet. Over 100 years is pretty good. You can go back much, much further, of course. You can look at hunter-gatherers. You can look at the one most people use is the Inuit when you're talking about carnivore. I mean, that's hundreds of thousands of years. The Maasai, they're pretty well known. They've been around a long time. They're definitely not a trendy group, are they? And I think any sort of traditional hunter-gatherer, we're looking hundreds of thousands of years. They've either been ketogenic or they've been carnivorous. The flip side, of course, is what is trendy? Well, oat milk is definitely trendy, but that's trendy for the wrong reasons. Yes, people are picking up on that, but that's because it's backed by a ton of propaganda. Before there was propaganda and media outlets telling people what to eat, they decided what to eat by using their observed reality. So hunter-gatherers went out and they realised that megafauna were the things to eat because you got more bang for your buck, made our brains bigger and made our structure stronger. And obviously, about 12,800 years ago, what happened was there was a sort of cataclysmic event on the planet. And a lot of the megafauna died out. And that's when agriculture took over. And we started eating grains and lots of carbohydrates. And that's when we saw our brains shrink and our body size shrink. And I think it's been a little bit backwards since then. But obviously now we're trendsetters, Lee. We're going to try and get keto and carnivore back in the mainstream and obliterate that ridiculous propaganda.
Type 2 diabetes is caused by fat.
Now, that doesn't even pass the scratch or common sense test. I can tell you why some people believe it, because they listen to influencers who are tapping into the fact that when you look at some butter at room temperature like that, well, you can imagine if you ate that, that would clog some things up because, you know, it's butter, isn't it? It's a bit claggy. But if we're going to use a 7-year-old's argument, let's have an actual look at it. So when you look at the body temperature compared to the room temperature now is between 20 to 22 degrees centigrade. 68 to 72 Fahrenheit. That's room temperature. Well, that butter, if I had that in my hand, if I had a blob of butter in my hand and I squeeze my hand and I get it to body temperature, which is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, that is going to lubricate things. So if we're going to use a 7-year-old's argument about clogging things up, well, butter isn't the thing. Now let's get our little hand around some sugar and we squeeze that and we get that to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. That's going to be a sticky mess. So if you're going to look at this in a ridiculous way that it clogs things up, well, actually, I think sugar is the bigger culprit because we know what diabetes is, chronically elevated blood glucose. So there's a little clue in what we're saying there. Well, what elevates blood glucose? Well, the last thing that elevates it is fat. And the thing that's most primary to raise it is carbohydrate. Now, I'm a specialist practitioner in diabetes and obesity for 15 years. And for the first 5 years, I believed the food guidelines. My observed reality, we use that phrase again, was that the only people that did well ignored my advice. And they were quite happy to say they ignored my advice. And I was quite happy to hear it because I was learning on the job. I really genuinely thought I was just doing a terrible job until I realized that I'd had terrible information given to me. And that the easiest way to reduce blood glucose and therefore insulin problems and problems of glucose metabolism was to not put them into your mouth in the first place, certainly not to put an excess amount into your body. So it took me 5 years to wake up to the fact that these people that were doing really well, when I would ask them, were doing Atkins. They were doing low carbohydrate. I don't remember people saying keto. I don't remember people saying carnivore, but that's what they were doing. And they were reducing their symptoms of type 2 diabetes. They were reducing their medications. And of course, now I've done this for 10 years and over 5 years with carnivore, I have seen at least 1,000 people reverse their type 2 diabetes. So going back to common sense, if people remove carbohydrates and reverse type 2 diabetes on a regular basis, and don't forget, when I was trained, I was told it was a chronic progressive disease that you could do nothing about, which obviously is clearly completely not true. That is a lie from mainstream medicine because it's reversible. That has happened. People say, well, it's not cured. Well, we're talking about putting something into your body that is doing it harm. Well, if you stop doing that, you are cured because you're cured of the input, the thing that's wrong, which you're constantly told by the mainstream you should still be putting into your mouth. If removing carbohydrates reverses type 2 diabetes, but the removal of fat doesn't, then that completely gives you the answer. It is one of the most ridiculous things out there.
When people experience issues on a carnivore diet, it has more to do with the previous diet rather than carnivore itself.
Let's be honest, most people are not swapping diets because they're healthy. I don't think anybody says, oh, I'm so healthy, I'm going to change. Some people give up after a week because they've transitioned too quickly. And there's many reasons why it's difficult. You've gone from a high insulin state to a low insulin state. And that is difficult for the body to adjust to because that has a huge knock-on effect. When you first come over to keto or low carb or carnivore, you're reducing the carbohydrates and you're increasing fats and proteins. So your body has all these physiological mechanisms in place. Its gut microbiome is where it is. Most people come over and they're pretty unhealthy in some way. For instance, because your blood pressure tends to get lower, and most people have high blood pressure, but they stay on the medications, they haven't really spoken to their medical practitioner properly. They haven't really gone into that side of things. They've not adjusted their medications, so they might have a problem there. If they're diabetic, exactly the same thing. If you're a diabetic that does know what they're doing, then hopefully you're going to reduce the doses compared to the carbohydrate intake. Some people don't remember to do that, so that makes sense as well. Other things, if you haven't got those complications, well, your gut microbiome is going to adapt. And I think there's a brilliant study at the moment where, I've had my gut microbiome analysed and it's optimal. I've been carnivore 5 years. I didn't do it when I first started. Maybe I should have done, but I'm not made of money and these tests are expensive. What's been studied is that when you first transition, sometimes the gut microbiome, there are some bacteria which are allegedly bad in inverted commas. That metabolite is not something you want, but as soon as you look at these people again after maybe 6 months when they've adapted, they have produced another bacteria that actually eats the alleged bad bacteria. So the die-off of some bacteria and the proliferation of newer bacteria can actually be the thing that we're waiting for. Obviously, keto flu, which is, again, to do with insulin and the fact that you now are in a lower insulin state, which isn't bad. It's just your body's got to adapt to it. Could be one of the reasons as well. And, of course, pressure, which not many people talk about. If your friends and family are not on board, you could be eating this way and finding a little bit of stress because everyone thinks you're crazy, you're weird, you're mad or whatever. And it's one of those things to expect you in transitioning to anything.
Breakfast is not the most important meal of the day.
You're absolutely right. It's not the most important meal of the day, but John Harvey Kellogg wants you to think that it is. There's a little clue in the name there. I think it was somewhere around 1890 or something like that, where he had his sanitarium, Broad Creek Sanitarium. And that was his rationale, that he wanted this plan to stop young boys masturbating. That was it. And he wanted this very ordinary diet, easy to digest, to make them lethargic, actually. And that's exactly what cornflakes were designed to do, to be plain, bland, stop your libido. And that is documented. So it was a marketing phrase, actually. And we've since found, obviously, with people experimenting, that for some people it is the most important meal of the day. They still prefer breakfast. And for other people, they don't want to eat until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It is a marketing phrase. But if you say it enough, it becomes sort of believed to be true. But breakfast isn't the most important meal of the day. But breaking your fast, which is where breakfast comes from, with the right food at the right time, that definitely is important. So he nearly got there, but his reasons were more commercial and rather nefarious, in my opinion. I think his brother also had something to do with the sugar industry. So I think there was a lot going on there when it comes to business.
Electrolytes, particularly magnesium and calcium, are too low on carnivore.
Right. Well, I have done over a decade of private blood testing. So when anyone says too low, you think compared to what? So that's the thing that you should look at. So when you have a high carbohydrate diet, maybe you do need a lot more of everything. So you have a lot of electrolyte excretion when you have a lot of insulin. And what gives you a lot of insulin? A lot of carbohydrates. So if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, then you're going to trigger insulin. Therefore, you're going to release a lot of electrolytes. That's because insulin acts on the kidneys and the kidneys retain sodium, but excrete magnesium and calcium, for instance. So this it leads to sort of like increased urinary losses of electrolytes. So when you come over to this way of eating, you have less insulin. So you excrete less of those magnesium and calcium electrolytes, which might sound like I'm not looking at this the right way, but you're ingesting a lot less as well. So the net result is actually your body balances in a better way because your fluid balance is better. I have done, like I say, over a decade of private blood tests, and I have yet to find anybody on their biochemistry be out of whack with their electrolytes, to be honest. And that's on any sort of diet because it's very tightly regulated. But when you're on a high carb diet, you definitely need more of those things to function properly. Magnesium, for instance, you need a lot more if you've got carbohydrate metabolism going on. It's also involved in the sensitivity of insulin and over sort of 300 enzymatic reactions that are involved in carbohydrate metabolism. Calcium is the same. It's involved in glucose uptake and muscle function and nerve transmission. But it is one of those things that you don't need in abundance when you're eating this way. They have such a lot to do with insulin sensitivity, water retention. Glycogen, for every 1 gram of glycogen, you need 3 grams of water. Or 3 to 4 grams. So electrolytes shouldn't be just looked at in isolation. And I think this is one of the important things, because when you go over to this way of eating, there might be moments where you think, I'm buying into this recommended daily allowance or what other people are taking or what this influencer is saying you need. Well, firstly, you need to say, well, where did they get that recommendation from? And 9 times out of 10, that recommendation is from those that are eating a high carbohydrate diet. That's what I was trying to say earlier about when you transition, everything changes. How much you need of something isn't how much you input, it's how your body handles it. So if you're not excreting so much, therefore you don't need to ingest so much. And that's hopefully the point I've made there, that what we do ingest, we get more bang for our buck because we're not simply just ingesting it and then urinating it straight out because there's less water retention, less insulin.
Glucose is the body's preferred fuel source.
Glucose is the preferred fuel source. Now, I've heard this very often, and of course, preferred in chemistry or actually physiology does not mean what we think of. Like your hat that you wore today, you might wear that 6 times out of 7 because you prefer it, but that's not what we're talking about when it comes to breaking down what we're ingesting. So if you look at the hierarchy of metabolism, actually, alcohol is the preferred one, but it isn't preferred. Well, it might be for some people watching, by the way. It might be preferred because it's most toxic. That's what it means. It takes preference, a bit like preference shares when you're talking about stocks and bonds and stuff like that. So alcohol would be the first thing that's metabolized. Why is that? Because it's the most toxic for the body. That is exactly why. It's metabolized in the liver and also slightly in the brain, which is why you get drunk. Then it's glucose. That's the next thing. Then it's proteins and amino acids, and then it's fats. So that you could look at as the order of toxicity, but that is also the preference order. So the preference is alcohol, then glucose, then proteins, and then fat. Again, going back to the body being brilliant, we have this tightly regulated band of 70 to 140 milligrams per deciliter of blood glucose, the glucose concentration that we want. If you look at any one snapshot in time, we need about 1 teaspoon of sugar in our bloodstream at any one time, 5 litres. That's basically what we need. So if you drink a can of Coke, that's like 9 teaspoons of sugar. So that's going to take priority. That is just toxic straight away. A can of Coke is toxic because we want 1 teaspoon, not 9. And then if you start looking at bread, and I've seen somebody do a little, well, there's only like 4 grams of sugar in this slice of bread. Well, no one has a slice of bread. Firstly, they normally have 2 slices of bread, and they also have something on it. So before you know it, that healthy sandwich that you've got from an outlet, you're having 9 teaspoons of sugar in a sandwich. You've only got to actually chew some bread and leave it in your mouth. And if you leave it for a minute, you'll suddenly realize that's pretty sweet. Yeah, it's not the preferred fuel source, not by any stretch of imagination. You could call it maybe the primary acute energy source, glucose. So when I do a type 1 diabetic and they feel that they're going hypo, there are 2 ways to deal with it. And one is quick-acting carbohydrates. So you could say that primary acute energy source. But I think it's certainly not preferred, and not preferred in the way that we talk about.
Calories in and calories out is BS.
Correct. But I will elaborate on why I think that. Firstly, people sometimes think it's a semantic argument because we're talking about a calorie. What does that mean? Well, that is the energy needed to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree centigrade. That's it. So you could actually do this experiment, which I have done, with a kettle. You can take a kettle at room temperature and you can boil it up and you can put 80 calories into it and you can weigh that water. And my kettle isn't perfect. So, it's not a scientific experiment. If it's a bomb calorimeter, it would be perfect. But you could then weigh that water and you've put 80 calories in and it weighs the same as when you started. So it still weighs a gram or a kilogram. For instance, most kettles can do a kilogram. And then if you let it cool and then it loses 80 calories, it still weighs the same. So that is it in a nutshell, that calories are literally heat energy, which has no mass. So that 80 calories didn't add mass. It was just energy, and it heated the water up, made it move more. And then when it cooled down, it just moved less. So the calorie thing is not a semantic argument, because it is important to understand it is just a measurement of energy, and those measurements of energy are photons. You can then do the common sense test, because if you've got 100 grams of salmon and you've got 100 grams of donuts or 100 grams of chocolate, they're all going to have very different effects on your body. And that, to me, is common sense as well. Also, protein makes structure. Carbohydrates don't make structures. And some of the fat, for instance, if you've got 100 grams of fats, well, some of those will go to make hormones. So they all have different roles. What else is different? Well, they'll make a different hormonal cascade happen. So we know already that fats hardly affect insulin, proteins a little bit, and carbohydrates a lot. So that just one thing, and then obviously glucagon and all your other things are going to change. The satiety signaling. I mean, everybody knows about certain carbohydrate foods you could eat a ton of and not feel full up. Whereas with meat, for instance, you really get that satiety signal. And then you're looking at nutrient partitioning. So it's going to go off to different places. Fat's going to go off to different places. It's going to help with your thyroid hormone, all those sort of things. It is rubbish. It's rubbish, whichever way you look at it. So I remember eating 4,000 calories because I had to track it for a YouTube experiment. 4,000 calories. No, I deliberately did no exercise, and I lost 4 pounds. All these things. Anyway, yeah, right. It is BS. There is a lot more to it. We could look at the mass of foods being important. For people that want to argue, well, what about, if you've got 100 grams of oil compared to 100 grams of spinach? Well, 100 grams of oil is 900 calories, because we know that fats have a lot of calories. 100 grams of spinach is 23 calories. You're not going to have 100 grams of oil because you're going to feel full. That's the whole point. And I think we should look at things like nutrient density per gram as possibly a sort of metric. But I think when you're carnivore or keto, it is just basically weighing the food, and or even just eyeballing it and eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full. But chasing calories is a ridiculous thing.
Red meat is hard to digest.
Red meat is hard to digest. Well, we know it isn't. You have done many videos about this. I've done a few videos about this. I think people are mixing up their signaling. So when you eat red meat, well, let's look at carbohydrates first. Actually, let's look at a rice cake. Right, a rice cake is sort of alleged health thing to eat. Well, when you eat that, it pretty much dissolves in your mouth because you chew it, you use your mechanical digestion, goes into your stomach, gets broken down pretty quickly, and empties your stomach pretty quickly. Okay, and you can feel straight away that you've got some sugar inside you, you've got some carbohydrate inside you. Well, red meat doesn't do that. Red meat, you chew it, it breaks down. Yes, that happens. It goes into the stomach acid, it breaks down. But the stomach emptying is much slower, which is part of this satiety effect. Also, it comes with fats, which are notoriously slow emptying. So you get the bile release. And your body is telling you you've eaten something pretty substantial. And of course, food isn't passive, it's active. So when it breaks down, it signals out how much stomach acid you need, what acidity level you need, actually, and how much bile is needed to emulsify the fats. Well, all that can sometimes, when you first start eating this way, that can feel a little bit heavy, or you can feel some discomfort because your bile isn't up to speed. So we're going back to what you said earlier about issues, and I saved it because I knew you were going to ask about this because it's close to our hearts. You could think that, but the more you eat this, the more it becomes, your body upregulates the way you eat meat, and then it becomes absolutely delicious and easy to digest. And as you know, you don't evacuate as much because there's hardly any waste. So it isn't hard to digest, but it might be when you first eat seem that way. You might buy the wrong cuts, or you might overcook it, so it becomes tough. And all of these things do help to understand that you can adapt to this way of eating, but it's certainly not hard to digest once you've adapted to this way of eating.
There's a big difference between grass-finished and grain-finished beef.
Well, is there? I mean, yes, you could, if you're getting very nuanced into it, say there is a difference. Let's be honest, most cows eat grass that are properly looked after. And then there is the option, how do you finish, with a little bit of grain or a little bit of continuing grass? And the grain finished is included to improve the fatty profile, let's say that. But it does have a little bit of a difference. I don't know if from your question you don't think there is a difference, or that you do think there's a difference, but there is a difference when you look at the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, or 3-to-6 ratio. So grass finished tends to have a better ratio. That's it in a nutshell. I would still rather have grain finished beef than anything that isn't carnivore, because it's still fabulous source of virtually every nutrient that you need. When they have studied the different cuts from different sources, grain finished and grass finished, you tend to find that the grass fed is slightly better. So like I say, the omega 3 to 6 is 2 to 1, I think, and omega 3 to 6 is 9 to 1 in grain finished. That seems to pop into my head. And you've also got basically higher absolute levels of omega 3. So the conjugated linoleic acid. But I think both are really good. Budget wise, if you can only afford the grain finished beef, go for it. At this point, I know the question was about beef, but lamb is also something to consider. Carnivore isn't just about beef, and that's a big thing, Lee, if you don't mind me just adding. You can have poultry, you can have fish, you can have a lot of variety, obviously eggs and stuff like that, but the question was about grain and grass finished beef, so I've finished on that. And if you're interested in all the bloods and everything I say, I do have it in my book, Guide to Blood Tests, and I've also just bought one out about statins.
Incredible. That's great, mate. I'll drop the links below as well.
All right, I'll send you the statins book. It's depressing beyond belief. Anyway, right.